Hello, ladies and gents. We're on module A328, block 4. How are empires experienced? Page 132. African resistance to imperialism. And resistors against it could also operate as a conflict along class lines within African societies. You'll see in the case study looking at the Women's War in Nigeria in 1929 how this could play out. Another explanatory concept that has been applied to anti-imperial resistance is that of primary and secondary resistance. The initial responses to colonialism are taken as primary resistance, as existing states and authorities attempted to fight off invasion and domination. Using defences, war and rebellion, often these reactions attempted to preserve the pre-existing social and cultural features in the polity. But sometimes new kinds of political structures emerged during primary resistance, even if it was unsuccessful. Secondary resistance has been defined as forms of resistance to continued colonial control, which united colonial subjects in ways that might cut across pre-existing categories. So, for example, urban workers could resist via trade unions. Secondary resistance could involve international solidarity, but it could also involve religious elements. This resistance often looked forwards to a new nationalist era in Haynes 2004. Terence Ranger, through his detailed research into the British conquest of Kenya, has shown how elements of primary and secondary resistance were entangled from the earliest stages of anti-colonial resistance through to the independence struggle. For him, some of the classic primary resistance struggles involved African territories that had already been altered by contact with the imperialized world. As you'll see later in this unit, Ethiopia fought off European conquest in 1896 as part of a process of claiming a place in this European defined world, with which it had been entangled for decades. Ranger 1968. This was nevertheless primary resistance. These two concepts, the subaltern and primary secondary resistance, thus remain what we might term useful simplifications. The former reminds us to consider ways that resistance could happen outside the elites in African societies, and the latter helps us to think about long-term changes in patterns of resistance. The varieties of resistance summary. The historiography of resistance often follows a pattern. Initial attention tends to be on the people who won, or those who adopt ideological or political positions similar to those who won. Kirk and McElligott. Subsequent to independence, national elites tended to write the history of the colonial period in the light of their specific experience of decolonisation. So, for example, the post independence history of Tanzania, formerly German East Africa, then the British Mandate of Tanganyika was dominated by studies of legitimacy and party allegiance in the colonial period because these had a salience to the country's political development. These kinds of preoccupation generally favoured the study of overt political categories of resistance, such as the Pan African movement, or of overt rebellions, such as the Chilembo. Additionally, rebellions that might have involved only one area of a state, especially one that was not subsequently powerful post independence, were less likely to be celebrated as precursors of independence, as you'll see in the section on the Women's War in Nigeria. This section has introduced you to a number of different categories that you can use when studying resistance to imperialism. The case studies in the rest of the unit will provide more detailed examples of all these elements, but they will not be so neatly divided because the landscape of resistance is inherently complex. Battle of Adwa. On the 1st of March 1896, the Ethiopian Empire defeated Italian attempts to conquest in a pitched battle of Adwa. This section will examine the background to this battle and also use it to talk about the initial phase of resistance, open resistance by African states to initial European expansion. Read this news report for an English provincial newspaper. They are using the name Abyssinia for Ethiopia. Briefly jot down a few points in response to the following questions. What are the measures of the magnitude of the defeat? Definitions. Abyssinia, the name by which Ethiopia was known by Europe at the time. Ras Maconian, one of the Menelik's generals and diplomats, also a provincial ruler in his own right. Osman Digna, the leader of the Sudanese Islamist Mahadist state, the Negus, the king, reference to Menelik. Per Reuters agency, Rome, Thursday. According to the information received here from Massawa, the army of Negus, which is advancing slowly, has reached Entisio, halfway between Adawa and Adigrat. Major Salsa, who has been to Emperor Menelik to arrange for a burial of the Italians who felt at Adawa, and to ascertain particulars regarding the prisoners, was met by 3 of Ras Maconian's lieutenants. He proceeded on the morning of the 9th inst for the camp of Negus. Communication with Kassala is not interrupted. Osman Digna is now a Gulisit. A majority of soldiers who have returned to Adawa were wounded. The Italia understands that the government has decided to adhere strictly to a defensive policy in Africa. The journal states that of the troops engaged in the Battle of Adawa, only 17% subsequently answered the roll call. The fatal majority of the remainder is unknown. A correspondent in Abyssinia of the Corriere della Sierra reports that the situation is grave and that all troops are demobilized, with the exception of battalions which have recently arrived. The Tribune, however, thinks these assertions are exaggerated. Paris, Thursday. It is reported that the Italian frontier, that trains are arriving there from the south, crowded with Italians who are leaving their country to escape military service in Africa. Ultimately, European control in Africa rested on violent conquest, or the threat of violence against this. Ethiopia was one African state to preserve its independence over the course of the post-1884 European scramble for Africa. It did so by military resistance, but this also involved diplomatic and religious elements. This military resistance was not temporary, as had been achieved by their defeat in 1896 or by the Zetas in 1879, but endured for decades. Final defeat only came in the Italian-Ethiopian War in 1935-36. Ethiopian success had a great impact at that time as well. For example, before the battle, the Times had referred to the Ethiopians of barbarous, but after described them as a civilized power. Pankhurst 2005, by winning the battle, the Ethiopians had demonstrated that their ambassadors and their appeals to Europe to treat Ethiopia as a sovereign state rather than as a prize to be conquered should no longer be ignored. Explaining why a particular side won a battle can be reduced to decisions taken on the day by generals of actions by units or commanders, but nearly always the decisive factors are elsewhere. In a combination of equipment, access to supplies, and the wider political situation, the Italian army at Adwa was smaller than the European Ethiopian one, but better equipped. Both armies had a mixture of modern rifles and older weapons. The Italian army had two machine guns and rather more artillery than the Ethiopian one. Vandervoort, 2011. The Italians attacked Adwa because their army was running out of supplies, whereas the Ethiopian army was refusing to melt away as expected. Thus, the Italians were forced to maneuver to try to tempt the Ethiopians into battle. They bungled the maneuver and paid the price. Many Africans won battles against Europeans in the 19th century, but these nearly all involved small detachments of imperial forces, mainly operating at beyond the point that they could usefully be supplied, as we saw earlier in the unit when we learned about the conquest of the Asante Kingdom in 1874. When the Europeans invested in transport and supply, they were able to bring overwhelming force to bear. African polities, which were small enough to remain politically united, were generally easy to defeat, and the confederations were easy to fight. Adwa was different in that the United Ethiopians were able to win the decisive battle, after which the Italians gave up their plans to conquer the interior, although they remained in occupation of the coastal province of Eritrea. And Ethiopia won international legitimacy and independent state. In this, they also differed from the Madis state in Sudan. To keep a large army in the field and ability to mobilize a large society to feed and supply it. The European command of the sea meant that they could send a large and resourced armies. Here, Ethiopia, a state that occupied a landlocked region, had an advantage. The deciding factor was political. The Ethiopian Empire was able to unify for long enough to keep an army in the field so that it could challenge the Italian one. This case study, therefore, will explain not just why the battle went the way it did, but the process whereby the Ethiopian state was able to build and maintain the unity, strength, and expertise to make the battle a decisive one. For the first half of the 19th century, Ethiopia was a number of individual states and loggerheads, and frequently at war with each other. The emperor's court shared a religion, Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity, often known as Coptic Christianity, with many of their subjects, and a language, Amharic with some. However, a substantial fraction of the people they ruled over the Muslims were ruled over were Muslims. In practice, the emperor had limited direct power. The empire was also hemmed in by other expanding powers. To the north was Egypt, which was nominally part of the Ottoman Empire, but in practice an expansionary power in its own right. Egypt was a Muslim state with a significant Christianity that shared Ethiopia's Coptic faith. To the northwest of Ethiopia was Sudan, which was also a target for the Egyptian and later Anglo-Egyptian imperialism. To the south, the Ethiopians were attempting to subjugate the Aroma states and make their peoples subjects. Emperor Tewodros II attempted to centralize the state and increase the power of the emperor. When he came to power in 1855, he first fought a series of wars within Ethiopia to consolidate his control. His policy was to ignore the traditional power of those local princes who did not immediately rally to his side. His wars to establish control were characterized by reprisal and brutality. Sewedi, he was constantly at war with his subjects as various provinces rebelled against him. Tewodros II justifies the actions, through the need for national unity and modernisation in the face of the increasing threat from European powers. He, conse- he consistently prioritised his military power, creating a national Ethiopian army and obtaining modern weapons for it. He repeated demand in contacts with Galat. He also established a national arsenal, and at Gafat he created a national arsenal, an establishment to manufacture, store and repair weapons. Zudi 2001, however, he was unable to unify all the various rulers' armies into one body and was plagued by an inability to collect enough taxes to support the troops he had mobilized. Tewodros II met his downfall through his entanglement with foreign powers. He had favoured Protestant missionaries over Catholics, although permitting neither to preach to his Orthodox subjects. Disastrously, after he did not receive replies to letters he had sent to European powers asking for help, he took umbrage and started taking European representatives and missionaries hostage, rather than forcing Europeans to take him more seriously, as he hoped. That ultimately brought a British-led army to rescue the captives, seeing that many of the local rulers he had treated harshly, equibated or helped the British. The British army that eventually defeated him was a heavily resourced and supplied one, organised along the same lines as the 1874 invasion of Ashanti, and crucially was part of the Indian Army rather than the British one. The majority of its units were Indian, and its south of Mumbai. It was helped in its march to his stronghold by his many internal enemies, notably the Negus, king of Tigray, Kasa Mersha, the future emperor, Johannes V, in 1868, having been defeated in battle at Magdala, besieged and with no prospect of relief. Tewodros II killed himself. After his death, a new claimant declared himself emperor, but was unable to bring together a coalition to defeat Kasa Mersha, who had used his connections with the British to acquire some modern weapons and take the throne in 1871. As Johannes V. Johannes V's main rival was Menelik, the ruler of the strong province of Showa. During the 1870s and 1880s, the international situation increased the pressure of Ethiopian rulers. The opening of Suez Canal in 1869 meant that the Red Sea was no longer a backwater. In the early 1800s, the British occupied Egypt in order to ensure control over this asset. The canal also meant that the access of East Africa's coast by Mediterranean powers, notably Italy, became much easier. The Ethiopian emperors shared a desire to control a seaport. This would enable them to manage relations with the rest of the world without relying on any foreign power. The country trade routes ran east towards the Red Sea ports. Of these, Djibouti was controlled by the French, and to the north of Massawa was nominally part of the Ottoman Empire, though under Egyptian control. The British, all powerful at sea, were happy for Italy to expand outside Europe, provided British sea routes to India were not threatened. Italy had united between 1848 and 1870 via several decisive wars. Thus, although rich in Ethiopia, it was not a lot older. Italy's rulers based around the destiny originating in the north around the port of Genoa and the industrial centre of Turin looked to the empire to unify. Empire offered political advantage. It was a motor for careers of ambitious politicians. Socially, it would create a space where Italians could migrate but still be subject of the Italian state. Economically, it was driven by a desire of traders and shipping owners in Italy for the state to carve out a sphere of influence in which they could profit. In 1880, the Italian government bought the port of Assab on the Red Sea from an Italian merchant, an active supporter of Italian imperial expansion, who had himself bought it from a local sultan in 1870. Diplomatic forms of resistance were thus open to the Ethiopians, however, although the Ethiopians hoped to be able to play the British, the Egyptians, and the Italians off against each other. By the 1890s, all three were happy to see Ethiopian independence extinguished. The Ethiopians were not nominally independent, but in practice, after 1882, their foreign policy was controlled by British Consul General. This post was in the theory similar to an ambassador, but in some respects more like a resident in a princely state of British India. If not a colonial governor, the Suez Canal meant that the Red Sea was now the route to India. Britain did not want any rival power to establish control there, but saw Italy as no threat and a potential ally against France. Thus, in the 1890s, the British were happy for Egypt to give control of some Red Sea ports in favour of Italy. In 1887, Johannes V asked for British support against Italian aggression, but none was forthcoming. By 1892, the British had formally agreed with Rome that Ethiopia was to be in the Italian sphere of influence. Diplomacy was wielded more effectively against the Ethiopians. Foreign powers were hoping to be able to use internal division within the Ethiopian Empire, encouraged by deliveries of weapons, to break its unity and weaken it. After all, this had worked when the British gave weapons to the Johannes V in return for allowing their troops to reach Tewodros II, and when the Italians armed Menelik II so that he, in his turn, could oppose Johannes. Religion was a unifying factor within the Ethiopian Empire among the dominant Amharic and Tigrayan peoples, but significant numbers of the empire's subjects were Muslim. The Ethiopian emperors made the mistake of thinking that Christian Europe would protect the Christian state of Ethiopia against its Muslim enemies and would refrain from conquering it in the manner Europeans were attempted to conquer the rest of the continent. It turned out that the European powers cared less about religion than they did about race and empire. Appeals by Tewodros II and Johannes V for Christian solidarity against Islam were met with rebuffs. Local rulers in the south, on the coastal regions to the northwest, did not necessarily think of themselves as being automatically part of the European Empire. Ironically, in this respect, Italy and Ethiopia were similar. Both states were attempting to forge themselves into nations via a process of war. The difference being that for the Ethiopians that the war was one defence, because other forms of resistance had failed. Military resistance to Italian demands was the only visible option. Tewodros II lost to the British in 1868 because he could not hold his country together. In 1896, the Italians expected that his successor, Menelik II, would have similar problems, but unlike Tewodros II, Menelik II had worked and fought to unify the various local nobles who were independent rulers in their own right. He was aided in his endeavour by the political activity of his wife, Tatu Beitel, who had her own independent power base before their marriage in 1883, and was linked to the mobility of northern Ethiopia, complementing Menelik II's power in the south. Tatu played a key role in the foundation of Menelik II's permanent capital, Addis Ababa, between 1883 and 1887. Menelik II had become ruler of the show with Providence in 1877, and his armies clashed with those of leaders of loyal to Emperor Johannes V. In 1889, Menelik II succeeded to the imperial throne in a series of civil wars, but Unlike Johannes II, who had kept his subordinate rulers at war with one another, on Teodotus II, who had not both tried and failed to eliminate their authority. Menelik II gathered into his service nearly all the powerful rulers and generals, and even those with whom he had previously been at war. One example of this was Raz, a title that translates a leader or a duke, Allah in Gidi. He rose from a humble childhood as a soldier genius and was made Ras of Arisia by Johannes V. His armies defeated the Egyptians, fought against Menelik II in 1882, and defeated an Italian detachment of Dogala. In 1887, after Johannes V died in 1889, Ras Ulia opposed Menelik II's bid for power, but in 1894 he made peace with Menelik II and put himself under his command. Throughout his career, Alula was a fierce opponent of the Italians who were occupying Eritrea. Tekeli Hamanot, 1847 to 1901, meanwhile was a ruler in Ethiopia, Gojam province. Johannes V sent Hamanot's troops into battle against Menelik II in 1877 and 1882. Garrison 2012. Menelik II decisively won the latter encounter, but when Menelik II gained the throne in 1889, Hamanot had submitted to him. The army he raised from Gojam fought at Adwa. Johannes V had been happy to deal with the invading British to strengthen his hand against Tewodros II. Menelik II behaved in a similar fashion with regard to the Italians, taking weapons from them in 1887 to fight against Johannes V. After coming to power in 1889, Menelik II signed the Treaty of Rochelle with Italy, which demarcated Ethiopia's borders. The Amharic translation confirmed Ethiopia's full sovereignty. The Italian language version contained different claims. But the Ethiopians had agreed to route all their foreign communications via an Italian-controlled port. The Italians claimed this amounted to a protectorate, while the Ethiopians demanded the right to continue to deal directly with states such as Britain and France. Ethiopians resisted the Italian interpretation. Menelik II now sought weapons from the French to add to those he had already obtained from the Italians. Italy had backed Menelik to destabilize Ethiopia, but once in power, he asserted his independence. Following a rebellion in Italian-controlled Eritrea, the Italians occupied the capital of Tigray, Adwa, in 1895 and defeated local leader Mangasha. The Italian leader Barashia commanded 30,000 Italian and 15,000 African troops, 20,000 of which were in Tigray, waiting for the Ethiopian forces to attack their position. However, whereas previous foreign incursions into Ethiopia had found some Ethiopians willing to help them out from their own advantage, this time this country remained united behind their leader, Menelik II, the Nagast, or King of Kings, who had been able to maintain the unity he had built over his career. Menelik II's response to invasion demonstrated the nature of the state that he helped to create. What are Menelik's policies and priorities in the period leading up to Adwa, as revealed by this reading? It was Saturday, market day, in Addis Ababa in September 1895. Two heralds made their way to the top of the mound, overlooking the market. Each carried a staff topped by banners of red and green. A horn sounded. People gathered around to hear an imperial proclamation. The emperor was calling the nation to arms. Ethiopia was going to war. Sometimes being a leader means knowing what not to do. When Menelik learned and Mangasha's defeat in January 1895, he did nothing. And when he heard in March of the Italian occupation of Tigray as far as south as Lake Eshengi. Menelik did not race to drive them out. In Africa and in Europe, Menelik's failure to respond immediately was taken as a sign of cowardice. Menelik is a myth, a remark attributed both to Teleki, Hamanot, and the Major Perotti Tossoli summed it up. In fact, nearly a year would pass between Magasha's humiliating route at Kotate and Senafe, and the first European rejoinder at a place called Amber Alaj. Yet Menelik knew that while his power could withstand the doubts of those who saw fear in his hesitation, it could not withstand defeat. Moreover, Tigray, the northern province, now claimed for Italy, was a restless land. Menelik, a southerner, had only nominal authority here. Although 6 years had passed since he had laid claim to emperor's title, he had never visited Tigray. He ruled the province only through rebellious lieutenants. Menelik would have to demonstrate his authority in a place where it had never been secure. Ethiopia rising the mobilization. What should Menelik do? At court, the pressure to respond vigorously was acute. Empress Tatu, her brother Ras Weli, and her fellow northerners, Mangasha and Lua, wanted immediate action, but war would have to wait. Military campaigns are shaped by the seasons. Heavy, sometimes violent rains fall in the summer months in Ethiopia, impeding all the most determined travellers. Menelik waited, and behind the scenes he prepared. In April 1895, he ordered a special tax to pay for rifles and cartridges. He courted the Muslim dervishes, sending gifts of horses and coffee. Menelik played down long-standing religious differences, emphasizing instead a common racial heritage. I am black and you are black. Let us unite to hunt our common enemy. Finally, in September 1895, at the end of the rainy season, Menelik issued his call for a national mobilization. He also ordered all Italians expelled from the Ethiopian territory. Ethiopia did not have a national army. What it did have was a strong military tradition that made service in national military an obligation both patriotic and religious. The organisation for this military has been called feudal. Given the personal nature of the military service obligation, the claim has an element of truth. In effect, the order passed down the chain of command from the emperor to the ras and regional governors, and thence to the heads of district.